Hey guys, I want to thank you for joining me in another episode of Jason Stewart Photography. In this week's episode, I want to talk to you about a compositional technique known as framing device. A framing device refers to a method of photography where you take the elements within your scene and you frame them in such a way that they surround your focal point or main subject, thus creating a frame within a frame. And the types of framing devices you can use are virtually endless. The only limitation is your imagination. You can find framing devices inside your house, outside your house, in nature, as well as in the city. When you're inside your house, you can use your doors as framing devices or windows. You can also pull back curtains and set your subject in between the pulled back curtains, and that can act as a framing device. If you want to get creative, and you have children who have Legos, what you could do is build the Lego set up in such a way that you can create a frame around your child and take a photograph that way. It's very creative and you can come up with some really neat images that way. In addition to Legos, you can use stuffed animals and creatively place them in such a way that they can be a framing device for your child. Now, what if you're out in nature? Well, if you're out in nature, there are a lot of options for you to use as well. You can use leaves, branches, trees. You can even use rocks as framing devices. You can use caves as framing devices. Really, anything that you can creatively think of when you're outdoors can work as a framing device if you use it correctly. Now, what if you're out in the city? Well, if you're in the city, you've got plenty of options for framing devices as well, such as architectural lines. You can use doorways to storefronts. You can use storefront windows. Your options for framing devices are really limitless in the city as well. You can even take a photo of something from inside your car and use the windows as a framing device for something you're shooting, or if you're taking a photo of somebody inside a car, you can actually reverse it and use the window as a framing device that way as well. There are so many creative ideas you can use, and I want to encourage you, at the end of this week's episode, I want to encourage you to take your camera out and really try to find some creative framing devices just for fun. That's your assignment for this week. And again, you can use the framing devices that are in your home or any of the ideas that you hear me talk about, or with the images that I'm about to show you of pictures that I've taken with framing devices. I just want you to go out and try it. It's a lot of fun, and you're going to see it's going to improve the quality of your image and just give it a little bit more pop. When you have an opportunity to use framing devices, you're going to see what a difference it's going to make in your images, because it's going to make your focal point or your subject that much stronger. Now, it's going to take some patience as you go out and you look for these devices, but what it will benefit you is not only will it help you learn to see framing devices as a compositional method, but most importantly, it's going to help develop the eye of a photographer in you, so that as you continue taking photos, you are going to continually improve in the way you compose your images, and your images are going to look so much stronger, and you are going to find a lot more satisfaction with your photography by implementing all of the different compositional rules and methods that I've been sharing with you over the last several weeks. The more you know how to compose an image with the different compositional techniques, the more fulfilling and exciting and purposeful, I think is a good word, the more purposeful your photography is going to be. What I want to do now is I want to take a look at some of the images that I have taken where I've used a framing device in my photo, so that you can see how I've implemented this compositional technique. This first image here is an image that I took inside my house. As you can see, my wife Lindsay is the main subject in this image. I took this photograph of her at Christmas, and the framing device that I'm using is just a simple window. But because of the soft light coming through this window, it really gives it a Christmas winter feel. In this next image here, you can see that I've used the leaves on a tree as a framing device, and it really just makes this image pop. It places our attention right on the main subject, and it really just adds a nice contrast to this image. Here's another image that I took of my son Jeremiah when we were at a friend's house. They live out in the country and they own an orange grove. And you can see that the orange trees on both the left and right side of him both act as framing devices that place our attention right upon my son, who is the main subject of this image. In this next image, you can see I got creative with this framing device. I took a picture of my wife, Lindsay, while we were at a winery in Temecula, California. And the framing device that I used was actually a mirror that was hanging. And so I placed my wife over on the wall, as you can see. And this just makes for a very interesting and compelling framing device. Again, our only limitations is our imagination. Anything can be used as a framing device. Let's look at some more images. This one here is one of my favorites. I actually just took this of one of my students in a photography class that I teach. And this photograph here is really special for her, I'm sure, because it's her grandmother's antique camera. It's a vintage Kodak Brownie camera. And for me as a photographer, I was really blessed that she allowed me to take this photograph of her as well, because this is a special part of photographic history, so to speak, with this wonderful vintage camera. And as you can see, I've used this camera as a type of framing device here, and the student appears as a mysterious photographer as she's hiding behind the lens. Here's another image of my friend's cat named Randy. I took this while we were out in the country on their farm, and you can see that I used the wooden logs to the side and in front of this beautiful cat as framing devices, and it really helps add a lot of color and just texture to this image. From the images that I just showed you, we can see that there are framing devices inside of our home, in our backyards. Even when we're at our friend's house, we can find nice framing devices to help enhance our images. Let's continue looking at framing devices by going out in nature now and seeing how I use framing devices when I'm in nature, whether it's landscape photography or other types of nature photography. Well, here's an image that I took when my family and I were in Maui. My wife and I paid for this special treasure hunt hike for my son to go on, and I stepped back as we started hiking through this area here because I just thought it was really interesting, and I wanted to get a photo of my wife and son along with our guide walking through the tall grass as well as the very thick branches and trees that you see. And both the branches as well as the thick grass make a powerful framing device that clearly put our attention on the main subject, which are the three hikers. In this next image, you can see that I captured an image of my wife in Seattle with the storm clouds above her. The umbrella is out, and yet we see that the tall weeds in front of her act as a very complementary framing device for this image. Looking at this next image, this is a self-portrait I took of myself when I was in Yellowstone National Park. I was out photographing and doing some video in this beautiful meadow here at Yellowstone National Park. And when I took this self-portrait, I decided to use this very large and curved tree as a framing device. In the way that this photo is composed, that tree and even the direction that I'm looking inspires viewers to search out the whole image. If you remember in a recent episode, we looked at the rule of space. I've applied the rule of space here, and because I'm looking out in the meadow, our eyes are naturally directed out that way. This picture would be a little less compelling if that tree wasn't there being used as a framing device. Here's another image that I took when my family visited the Great Smoky Mountains. My family and I had traveled to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in order to remember and celebrate the life of my dad, who had recently passed away. And he loved spending time outdoors, and especially in the Smoky Mountains. And this image represents an unforgettable moment for me that I will cherish forever, as it not only reminds me of my dad, but it also reminds me of the great adventures that he took me on as I was growing up. And it was those adventures that really helped develop a deep love for the great outdoors and nature. And so this is a really special image to me. But looking at this image, what do you think that I used as a framing device? Well, the focal point is the beautiful sunset, along with the beautiful smoky clouds that are covering the forest. And so the framing device that I use is the trees that are silhouetted, not only on the right and left of the image, but also at the lower part. They make a perfect frame within a frame. In this next image, this is an image that I took on a trip to Maui, and I used the wooden poles in this fence as a framing device to capture an image of the beautiful meadow with the horses that are off in the distance. Here's an image that I took in Israel of a rock wall, and I use this rock wall as a framing device, as you can see, to capture the beautiful meadow with the trees behind it, and even the houses that are spread out across the mountain range in the distance. But the rocks are used as a framing device. And so we see in these photos that I just shared, there are an endless amount of framing devices that we can use when we're out in nature as well. Again, our only limitation is our imagination, and the more we work on it, and the more we patiently practice and look for framing devices, the more we're going to develop our photographer's eye, which is a good thing, because then we are going to begin taking better images on a more consistent basis. Well, let's go ahead and look at a few images that I took of wildlife so that you can see how I use framing devices in wildlife photography. This first image here is of an elk that I captured while in Yellowstone National Park. And as you can see, I used the leaves and the branches of the trees that were surrounding the elk as framing devices to help place our attention upon the main subject, which is the elk. Now, I could have zoomed in closer and taken a picture of the elk, but I believe by using the surrounding elements as a framing device, it really captures the essence of this photo, that we are out in the middle of the wilderness, and I believe it helps tell a better story. Here's an image of a moose that I took a picture of while in Montana. And as you can see, I've used again the trees and the branches as a framing device. Unfortunately, because the trees and the branches were so thick and this was the only option, I really had to even take a picture of this moose. I wasn't able to get the baby that was actually with the mom at the time. The baby's on the right side of the image. I wish I could have got both of them, but it just didn't happen. Here's one more image that I took of another elk in Yellowstone National Park, and I used the elk itself as a framing device this time for the tourist that was taking a picture. I just thought it was very humorous that this tourist was taking a picture of the elk herd that was in the direction that her camera is facing, and yet we see a lone elk watching the tourist. I just thought there was some humor in that. The elk is watching the tourist who is watching the elk herd. So as you can see, there are an endless amount of framing devices we can use inside the house, in the backyard, around the house, as well as when we're in nature or even when we're photographing wildlife. Well, let's go into the city now and see what type of framing devices we can find when we're in the city. In this first image here, it's one of my favorite images I've taken with a framing device. This is of the famous Batman building in downtown Nashville. I captured this photo of the Batman building while traveling to Nashville, and the story I wanted to tell with this was that there is a bit of Gotham City in Nashville. I captured this image a short while after the sun had set, and I used a 30-second exposure, which means I was using a tripod. But by using a 30-second exposure, it helped create this beautiful purple tint in the sky. And I purposely framed the Batman building with the industrial-looking beams from the bridge that I was taking the photo from. All of which I believe really helped add to a Gotham City feel for this photograph. Finally, I was so thankful. Like I told you, this was a 30-second exposure, and I don't know if you noticed or not, but there's a man sitting on the bench. And fortunately for me, he continued sitting still on the bench for the entire shot. I often wonder, was that Alfred, Batman's butler? In this next image here, you see I took a picture of a woman jogging, and the framing device that I'm using is the warning sign to say private property, keep out. I've titled this particular image Breaking All the Rules because this female jogger is breaking all the rules as she's pushing herself on this morning run. Next, I've took this image of my son Jeremiah when we were at Disneyland in front of the famous Mater's garage, and as you can see, I've used the big metal garage door as a framing device for my son. Here's another image of my wife Lindsay when we visited the Czech Republic. We were in Old Prague when we took this picture, and I used the two windows on this old yellow vintage looking building as framing devices for my wife. Well, I hope you've been able to see that framing devices can play a very important role in your photographic composition, and they can powerfully help you create compelling images that will inspire others. Again, it's going to take some patience and some time for you to develop this skill and be able to master this compositional method. But if you will be patient and you will take the time to really search out the different types of framing devices, not only in your home, around your house, but in nature and in the city, you are going to see a vast improvement in a lot of your images when you're able to implement a framing device. Hey, before we go, would you do me a huge favor and hit the like button? And if you haven't subscribed yet, would you also hit the subscribe button? Each time you hit the like button or subscribe button, it lets YouTube know that you like this content and want to see more of it, and it really helps me out. I'm really trying hard to reach my first goal, which is 1,000 subscribers, and any support you could give would just really be helpful and encourage me to keep making these videos. But again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you found it helpful. Now go out and practice these techniques that I'm sharing with you and see if it'll improve your photography and really inspire you to get out there and take more. Well, until next week, go out and capture the world.